Okay, so in that last video, we were talking just in general about what the social institution is that we call medicine. And you can see already that I've pulled up this whiteboard. Medicine is a social institution that aims to prevent, diagnose, and treat illness while also promoting health. That's the definition or sort of the description that I might get from that I may have gotten from your book, but it's not clearly defined in your book so much. If you ever watch the Crash Course Sociology the Crash Course Sociology video, that's definitely linked to your readings in Eagle. The definition that they give is it is a social institution responsible for treating disease or restoring or improving the health of a population. In both of these definitions, we see the same thing that the medical institution or medicine has a two-part sort of function. One is taking care of disease, the other one is taking care of health. It's important here that you see the word health in both of these definitions, but maybe even significant too that you see the difference in the use of the word disease and in health. In one of those last videos, we said that disease is structural or physical dysfunction of the body. Something is wrong with the body, and that is opposite of health because health is a state of physical, mental, and social well-being. When we were talking about how do we know what physical diseases are, we were talking about the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases. When we were talking about sort of how do we know when someone is mentally unhealthy, we were talking about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That social well-being part is one of the things that I want to talk to you today about illness. So disease and illness are not exactly the same thing. In regular conversation, we often use them interchangeably. So what makes the list? What makes the list of things that we would classify as no longer healthy? When the body is healthy, that means it's in a state of physical, mental, and social well-being. When it is not healthy, we would refer to that as a disease or an illness or sickness or any one of those kinds of words. So the first word that I want to give you, and these are the whole of this we can consider to be sort of the symbolic interactionist approach in understanding the medical institution, because really we're just talking about sort of namings and meanings and understandings of what are we talking about. The first one of those words I want to give you is the medicalization of something. The medicalization of a phenomenon, if you will, is the process by which aspects of life that were considered bad or deviant are redefined as sicknesses and needing medical attention to remedy. So when you in the last video we were talking about sort of this separation between the mind and the body, the point at which we feel like as a society, particularly in sort of contradiction to other types of religiosity, there's a point where we feel like we can treat the body when something is wrong with it. There's a point at which we feel like we can treat the mind when something is wrong with it, which is, how we came up with this ICD, the classification of diseases, things that are going on with the body, or the DSM, this list of things that are going on with the mind, right? So when we medicalize something, we are sort of deciding that it is something that can be treated with medicine or this institution that's trying to prevent, diagnose, and treat illnesses or treat diseases. This is important because when you think about what might be on that list, we've often heard about homosexuality being on the list in the DSM as mental disorders. If you designate it as a mental disorder, then you have medicalized that behavior, for instance, anything that you might have considered bad or inappropriate as sexual relations between people of the same gender. If you list it in the DSM as a mental disorder, then you're also deciding that there is a certain amount of treatment or something that you can do to sort of fix this disease or fix this illness. We've seen over the last several years an expansion of ADHD diagnoses, for instance. I don't think it's because people are necessarily more there are more people with ADHD or ADD than they used to. It's just that when we redefine or refine what the definition of it is, then we're able to use those standards to diagnose people who may have needed the diagnosis before, but maybe didn't get the diagnosis because we had to refine the definition. The same thing for people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Any of those disorders that we might consider to be autism, we've seen this rise in that number. Again, it's not because more people are just autistic, it's because we've refined those definitions in some way, in better medicalizing what this is. And so we can identify people who may need that diagnosis or not. When we consider those three examples, for instance, homosexuality, ADHD, or the autism spectrum disorder, when we think about what's on the list in the DSM or what's on the list in the ICD at any particular time, we're seeing reflections of those medicalization processes in society. There are some things that might not ever be on the list, or things that we're always saying we need to do better about the list. One of the things that come to mind for me is fibromyalgia. We hear that term fibromyalgia a lot, but we don't exactly know what causes it. And like, we're not really completely sure about what's included in fibromyalgia. So it's on the list, but there's some medical professionals who still don't believe it's real, for instance. They don't know how to identify it. They don't know how to treat it. We see the same thing with depression or clinical depression or anxiety. At what point do you know that something is, people are stressed all the time, but when do you know that stress is at a level that is more than the normal population, for instance? That's a question of how might we medicalize a particular issue. When you can medicalize something that we have socially considered to just be bad or deviant, like addictions, for instance, then what you have is an ability to diagnose, identify and diagnose and treat a particular illness, for instance. And it also changes the way that we deal with whatever that thing is in society. We might see a reduction in the kind of prejudice that people who have that diagnosis have received because they've just been labeled deviant otherwise. And maybe lesser in the moment that I'm recording this, there's an opportunity to get a better understanding of some of the diagnoses through research grants and studies that go into understanding it more. If you understand autism spectrum disorder, for instance, more, then you can refine those definitions. You can diagnose more clearly or more responsibly. The same thing with ADHD. The same thing ultimately in the future with fibromyalgia or sickle cell disease or depression or anxiety. So being able to medicalize it and get it to be institutionally recognized, something like an illness or a disease, or just something that's opposite of healthy, and is a medical issue, then you can sort of treat it as that. And that's important, to be able to consider something as a medical issue that needs treatment versus something that we just decided is bad and horrible, and that's just somebody being deviant. Something else that's important in this idea of things that we might consider to be deviant versus medical is stigma. And you can see I'm in my recording studio. I don't have a lot of writing space, so this is why I'm typing. You probably can read what I'm typing better, but it's not necessarily easier for me to get through. Your book does talk about stigmatization. It's the act of spoiling someone's identity. A person who is stigmatized, something about their identity. Remember, identity is your unique sense of self. Somebody who is stigmatized, or stigmatization, is the act of spoiling someone's identity. They're labeled as different, they're discriminated against, and sometimes they're even shunned due to an illness or a disability, right? So the cool thing about medicalizations of something like addiction, for instance, allows us to talk about it as a medical issue, allows us to consider what it might mean to diagnose and treat that medical issue. The same thing with something like obesity. If we medicalize it, then we think about it as a medical issue that needs treatment and diagnosis. And when we go back to those earlier conversations of economics and who's responsible for it and where's the healthcare come from, from, and how do we make sure all of those things matter when we decide to medicalize something. Because without that medicalization, then what we have is a stigma of labeling someone as deviant or bad or terrible, and as if their behavior is just their fault. There's something wrong with them, for instance. Sometimes the illness, even after we are able to medicalize it, or it's been medicalized a long time, could still carry that social stigma. And having the diagnosis of a particular illness might then stigmatize the person. So let me give you an example. If you are a person who has depression and you are kind of mopey, or you have sort of difficulty socially, you might be labeled as deviant. You're a problem. But if you understand depression as a medical issue, then you might forgive the person for their behavior, for instance, or forgive their moods here and there, because you might say, oh, I understand that's a medical issue. This person has depression and we can look it up in the DSM. We understand it, right? You might even figure out a way to treat it. And, we got this back and forth about, we understand through that medicalization that we're not just dealing with deviant and bad and terrible people. We've got a medical issue on our hands, right? A mental health issue in that example. Let's say on the flip side that you totally appear to be healthy to the people around you. Nobody has had any reason to make judgments about you. But then they found out, for instance, that you have HIV. All of a sudden, even though nothing about you or your behavior has changed, they were fine with you today, because we have some social ideas about HIV, and we have social stigma about HIV, then all of a sudden your identity is stigmatized because of your diagnosis, right? So we can stigmatize somebody's identity or spoil somebody's identity with this diagnosis, for instance. The stigmatization of illness is illnesses that are discriminated against and whose sufferers are looked down upon or even shunned by society. So we know that people with HIV or AIDS are stigmatized. We know that people with certain skin disorders are stigmatized. We see ads on TV all the time for people with psoriasis. If you walk around with psoriasis and a great big, rash on your body, there's nothing wrong with you and your identity. You have a medical condition, but it carries a certain amount of stigma that then might be attached to you and your identity. We've talked about your medical condition might become part of your master status. Maybe I don't talk about the fact that you're the best violinist in high school. I talk about that person who's got vitiligo, right? Because I am then paying attention to this medical condition that they have. And it is the thing that spoils your identity. It carries the stigma. You become identified and labeled as that person. And any feeling that we have about that disease, for instance, or that condition becomes the thing that is then attached to you. And remember, these things are the kinds of sort of concepts that symbolic interactionists would talk about. One of the maybe more recent example is even the change of the use of the words that we may have in order to reduce stigmatization of something. So we used to call people who are intersexed hermaphrodites, but that carry way too much stigma at some point. And so we start to talk about them as intersex, or people who are intersex individuals, or people with intersexual disorders. Some way to sort of talk about the condition to challenge and remove the stigma. The same thing with opioids. We very openly talk about opioids in such a way to talk about the struggle that some people have with opioids. However, it used to be that we might just call opioids heroin, right? Because heroin is an opioid, but it carried a whole lot of stigma. And some opioid users who use and are addicted to opioids that they were prescribed by the doctor might find themselves at some point addicted to heroin because it's a more natural progression of the type of drug. And we'll still talk about them as opioids because it doesn't carry the same amount of stigma. The last thing that I want to talk to you about is this word illness. Remember, medicine is the social institution that aims to prevent, diagnose, and treat illness while also promoting health. That's one of those definitions. And what I said is that health is a state of physical, mental, and social well being. The opposite of that is not well being, for instance, physically or mentally or socially. So, what does socially have to do with it? I can look at the ICD and find physical disease. I can look at the DSM and find mental disorders. What does this social thing have to do with it? Illness is really about the social and cultural response to a disease. You can have social health or social well-being. And when we think about that stigmatization again, for instance, if as a society we recognize that addiction, for instance, is like let's say it's a mental health disorder, then when somebody has addiction, then they don't lose the mental or social well-being. You just simply say that person has addiction. Think about when somebody physically breaks their leg. They do not carry the stigma of that injury or the stigma of that problem. They simply just have a broken leg. Their social well being is still okay. A person, however, who was born with a difficulty with their legs, who may live their lives in a wheelchair, we don't necessarily stigmatize whatever the illness is or the diseases that they have or the disorder that may keep them wheelchair bound. But the question is whether or not they're socially well, whether or not, we don't stigmatize the fact that they use a wheelchair, or we don't sort of assume that they're less intelligent because they use a wheelchair. Illness is about how we socially understand or how that person experiences the world based on this diagnosis that they have. So think about an illness belief is an assumption about the severity or nature of somebody's symptoms. And so if I told you today that I don't feel very well, um, if you are more likely to allow for the medicalization of that, then when I want to sit down and talk to you, or if I want to, sort of be quiet or decide that I don't want to go out this evening, for instance, you might say, okay, let's get you some chicken soup. Let's make sure we take care of you. Let's make sure you get some rest, right? You in that case, if I'm interacting with you and I tell you that I don't feel well and I need to sit and rest, you are acknowledging this um state of not well-being, right? Whether or not there's an actual diagnosis, maybe I don't take a COVID test. There's no COVID test to say I'm COVID positive. I didn't go anywhere to take a flu test, so we don't know that I have the flu. I haven't been to the doctor, so I don't know if I have strep throat. I don't know if there's anything wrong with me at all, right? Or nothing that I've been able to codify with the ICD at the doctor. I don't know yet. I'm just telling you that I don't feel so well. How you respond to that is what we're talking about with illness. You could say, let's get you some chicken soup and everything's fine and we'll take care of you. Or you can say, girl, ain't nothing wrong with you. Just get on up. You still got things to do. Just go on out and go get it. Let's go. We said that we were going to hang out tonight, so we're going to hang out tonight. So there is a social component to our ability to be ill or our ability to receive sort of acknowledgement of what that illness is. And then the truth is that we experience our mental, physical, and social well-being differently based on whatever that condition is. Gender plays a role. Men are more likely to downplay their symptoms when they're in pain or when they don't feel well, because we don't socially allow for their illnesses the way that we might allow for women to be in pain or talk about some of the symptoms that they have. You might experience your medical issues differently in terms of your family. In my family growing up, if I woke up in the morning and said I didn't feel well, my mom would just she didn't care if I stayed home. For some families, if you wake up and say you don't feel very well, you just better get up and go to school. You can deal with it later. You can take some Robitussin and go on about your way. Especially when it comes to some of these other things like addictions, for instance, or mental health disorders, depression or anxiety, or even ADHD. If your family, for instance, thinks that what you need is structure and discipline, then it doesn't matter that ADHD is listed in the DSM as like a real thing because there is no acknowledgement of that you have, right? Um, Race can play a part in it. You know, Black people historically have had a general mistrust of the medical institution. I know in my family in particular that even when my own sister was diagnosed with cancer, um, the talk about it was generally as if we wanted to assume that it was something else, or it wasn't yet cancer, or maybe it was going to be cancer, but we weren't really sort of taking their word for it because institutionally or historically, my community has not very much had a trust of the medical community. Social economic status can matter, right? If I wake up this morning and I'm sick and I work at Walmart, I'm just, I'm a cashier or I stock the shelves. I don't know if I'm sick enough to call off work, right? I don't know if my boss, my supervisor, my manager is going to consider me sick enough to not go to work. Whereas as a professor, if I don't feel well today, all I have to do is call somebody and say, I'm not coming. Nobody has to ask. Nobody wants documentation. Nobody's judging me, right? So socioeconomic status and where you are has something to do with whether or not people will acknowledge and accept again whatever your experience is. So medicine, this sort of designation of how to treat people's health or non-health, comes with defining what is health or on the opposite, what is not health, and then how do we acknowledge those things? How do we treat people with it? And that includes then the medicalization of it. When do we get to put things on that list? And then once we put things on that list, do you are you stigmatized for having it? Or do we give you a pass for your behavior because you have it? And then what is your social experience of it? So there's a lot of stuff that symbolic interactionists would think about when it came to medicalization or medicine and health. The last thing that I want to talk about in this case is the distinction between impairment and disability. This is the last thing here on this video. And this is very important when we're thinking about this social component. An impairment is a physical limitation. It's a physical limitation that a person faces. Your book says of the physical limitations that a less able person faces. A disability is a reduction in one's ability to perform everyday tasks. And the reason why this is important as a distinction, especially with the ways that it creates sort of a social understanding. The World Health Organization, the WHO, we've seen them as one of the creators or as an international organization. They, along with a handful of countries, are important for the international classification of diseases, amongst a host of other things. They would consider a disability a social limitation. And the reason why is because the reason why a person may be less able to manage or perform their everyday tasks, part of that might be because the social environment disables you. If if you are wheelchair bound and you have a class at Rock Valley College on the second floor, if I do not give you a way to get upstairs to the second floor when I assigned you that second floor class, I have disabled you. Rock Valley College has disabled you, right? You are unable to perform your basic everyday tasks of getting upstairs to a place where you need to go, right? So a disability is the inability or a reduction in one's ability to perform their everyday tasks. And we make the distinction between those being sometimes socially imposed reductions of ability to do something versus a person who has sort of a limited ability to do something for a short amount of time. An impairment is a physical limitation. If I broke my foot and now I'm on crutches, or I broke my foot and now I'm in a wheelchair, I don't have a forever long inability to manage my everyday tasks. I am simply limited for the time being. I have an impairment. That's the distinction that we might make between an impairment and a disability. The Americans with Disability Act of 1990 required recognition that we design the world in such a way to make sure that we are not disabling people from being able to take care of the things they need to take care of. If a person has an impairment, if a person has a medical condition, and there's just no way to give them back a particular ability to do something. If you're paralyzed, you might not ever be able to walk again. I can't give that back to you, but I can make sure that your inability to walk, for instance, doesn't keep you from experiencing the world any differently than anybody else, at least as much as possible. So that distinction becomes very important. One is about permanence, one is not. But even when we think about a disability and think about, again, that stigmatization of one's identity, it's very weird to have somebody carrying around the stigma of a disability, for instance, or the problem of what it is they can and cannot do, when we often are the ones that put them in that position. Off my soapbox. Thank you so much.